January 12, 1945. Guam, Mariana Islands. The sun hung low over the coral ridges of Guam, casting long shadows across the wire perimeter of the prisoner-of-war compound. Inside the fenced enclosure, 17 Japanese soldiers sat in rigid silence, their backs straight despite exhaustion, their eyes fixed on the distant palms swaying in the Pacific breeze. They had been captured 3 days earlier during the brutal fighting in the island's northern highlands, pulled from caves and foxholes where they had expected to die. Now they waited, not for interrogation or execution, as they had been taught to expect, but for something their training had never prepared them to understand. An American Marine guard approached the fence carrying a canvas bag. The prisoners stiffened. One man, a former schoolteacher from Osaka named Corporal Takashi Yamada, closed his eyes and whispered a final prayer to his ancestors. But when the Marine reached through the wire, he was not holding a weapon. He was holding a baseball glove. Dark leather, worn smooth at the pocket, smelling of oil and grass and something impossibly foreign, the scent of peacetime. Behind him, another guard carried a steel pot of coffee, steam rising into the tropical air like an offering to gods no one had taught these men to recognize. This moment, repeated in dozens of camps across the Pacific Theater between 1944 and 1945, represented a collision between two incompatible understandings of war, honor, and what it meant to be human. For the Japanese soldiers who had survived capture, a fate worse than death according to the Senjinkan military code, the first hours in American custody became a profound psychological rupture. They had been raised in a culture that viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace, taught that enemy captors would inflict unspeakable tortures upon those who laid down their arms. The Imperial Japanese Army's field manual explicitly stated that soldiers must fight to the death rather than face the shame of captivity. Propaganda films shown to troops before deployment depicted American Marines as barbarous demons who murdered prisoners without mercy, who desecrated bodies and committed atrocities that made death in battle seem merciful by comparison. Every Japanese soldier carried this knowledge into combat like a second weapon, a psychological armor that made surrender unthinkable and last stands inevitable. Yet here, on a sun-bleached island 7,000 miles from Tokyo, that entire worldview was beginning to crack like old porcelain. The baseball gloves arrived at prisoner camps throughout the Pacific as part of a broader American policy that bewildered both the captives and many of the captors. While European theater POW camps operated under Geneva Convention guidelines that most belligerents grudgingly respected, the Pacific War had devolved into something more primal, more absolute. Japanese forces had committed documented atrocities against Allied prisoners, the Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the systematic starvation and execution of captured soldiers. American forces, in turn, had developed their own brutal efficiency, a shoot-first mentality born from banzai charges and kamikaze attacks that left little room for mercy. Taking Japanese prisoners alive remained rare not because of American policy but because Japanese soldiers so rarely surrendered. Those who did often attempted suicide in captivity or attacked their guards with whatever makeshift weapons they could fashion. The psychological profile of a Japanese POW in early 1944 was that of a man in profound spiritual crisis, convinced he had betrayed everything sacred, certain his family had been notified of his honorable death, knowing he could never return home without facing irredeemable shame. Into this darkness, the Americans brought baseball and coffee. The decision to treat Japanese prisoners with unexpected humanity did not spring from naive idealism but from calculated military intelligence strategy. American interrogators quickly discovered that Japanese soldiers, once they had crossed the psychological threshold of capture, often became remarkably cooperative sources of information. The shame of surrender was so absolute that many prisoners felt they had already lost everything: their honor, their families, their very identity as Japanese men. In this state of spiritual annihilation, the kindness shown by American captors produced a cognitive dissonance so powerful it shattered remaining ideological resistance. A soldier who had prepared to be tortured and killed, who instead received hot coffee and a cigarette, who was treated for his wounds and given a blanket, found every certainty he had carried into battle dissolving like sugar in warm water. The baseball gloves, arriving in Red Cross packages and military supply requisitions, became an unlikely instrument of psychological warfare, not through cruelty but through incomprehensible generosity. Corporal Yamada, the schoolteacher from Osaka, sat in the compound holding the leather glove as if it might explode. He had never seen a baseball glove before. In Japan, the sport existed but remained largely an urban phenomenon, played by university students and professional teams in major cities. Rural boys like Yamada had grown up with kendo and judo, martial disciplines that emphasized honor and sacrifice. This strange padded mitt, shaped like an oversized hand, represented something beyond his experience, a culture that devoted resources to games, that valued leisure and play even in wartime. He watched as the American guards organized themselves in the clearing beyond the wire, one man holding a bat, another winding up to pitch. They moved with casual grace, laughing at missed swings, arguing good-naturedly about strikes and balls. The sound of the bat connecting with the ball, that sharp crack echoing across the compound, made several prisoners flinch reflexively, mistaking it for gunfire. But it was not death arriving. It was only a game. The coffee represented an even more profound symbol of American abundance. In Japan, coffee had been a luxury item even before the war, available only in expensive Tokyo cafes and foreign hotels. Most Japanese soldiers had never tasted it. They drank tea, green tea prepared according to centuries of tradition, a ritual that connected them to their ancestors and their culture. The black bitter liquid the Americans offered tasted foreign and strange, but it was hot, and it came in unlimited quantities, poured from steel pots that never seemed to empty. Prisoners who had been subsisting on handfuls of rice and whatever they could scavenge from the jungle found themselves presented with K-rations, canned meat, chocolate bars, cigarettes. The sheer waste astounded them. American guards threw away half-eaten rations without thought. They discarded cigarettes after a few puffs. They complained about the quality of food that seemed to Japanese prisoners like a feast prepared for emperors. This casual abundance, more than any weapon or tactical superiority, revealed the true gulf between the two nations. Japan was starving, its cities burning under B-29 fire raids, its merchant fleet at the bottom of the Pacific, its people reduced to eating acorns and bark. America was playing baseball and drinking coffee. The historical record of POW treatment in the Pacific Theater reveals a complex and often contradictory picture. Official U.S. military policy, as outlined in field manuals and command directives, mandated humane treatment of prisoners in accordance with international law. In practice, the brutality of Pacific combat and the mutual atrocities committed by both sides created an environment where mercy seemed a dangerous luxury. Yet the documentary evidence from camps like the one on Guam, and others on Saipan, Okinawa, and the Hawaiian Islands, shows systematic efforts to rehabilitate Japanese prisoners psychologically as well as physically. Camp commanders organized recreational activities, provided educational materials, allowed prisoners to form their own governance structures. The baseball games became a fixture of camp life, with prisoners eventually forming their own teams, playing against each other with an intensity that both amused and puzzled their American guards. Photographs from these camps, now preserved in the National Archives, show Japanese POWs in makeshift uniforms, caught mid-swing or diving for ground balls, their faces displaying an expression rarely seen in wartime documentation, genuine joy. The psychological transformation that occurred in these camps did not happen uniformly or universally. Some prisoners remained withdrawn, refusing to participate in activities they viewed as collaboration with the enemy. Suicides, while less common than Japanese propaganda had predicted, still occurred with tragic regularity. Men who could not reconcile survival with honor found ways to end their shame, hoarding pills, fashioning nooses from shoelaces, provoking guards into shooting them. But for many, the cognitive dissonance created by American treatment produced a gradual ideological thaw. They began to question what they had been taught about the enemy, about the war, about the divine destiny of Imperial Japan. The baseball glove in Corporal Yamada's hands became a physical manifestation of this internal conflict. To accept it meant acknowledging that Americans were not demons. To learn the game meant engaging with enemy culture on its own terms. To enjoy playing meant admitting that even in captivity, life might contain moments of unexpected pleasure. By March 1945, the compound on Guam had expanded to house over 300 Japanese prisoners. The baseball games had evolved from awkward experiments into organized leagues, complete with standings, statistics, and intense rivalries between teams. Yamada, who had spent his first week in captivity expecting death, now served as captain of the Okinawa team, named ironically after the battle that had yielded many of its players. He had learned to catch, to throw with accuracy, to read the pitcher's intentions. More importantly, he had learned to laugh again, tentatively at first, then with increasing freedom. The American guards, many of them farm boys from the Midwest who had never left their home states before the war, found common ground with their captives through the universal language of sports. They taught English using baseball terminology. They traded cigarettes for Japanese lessons, learning to count to 10 and say please and thank you. They showed photographs of their families, their farms, their girlfriends back home. The prisoners, in turn, began to share their own stories, carefully at first, then with increasing openness. They spoke of rice paddies and fishing villages, of siblings and parents, of lives that now seemed impossibly distant, perhaps irretrievable. The coffee, initially viewed with suspicion, became a currency of its own. Prisoners learned to prepare it according to American preferences, strong and black, served in steel cups that retained heat in the cooling evening air. The ritual of coffee drinking, the gathering of men around the pot, the casual conversation, the momentary pause from the grinding reality of captivity, created a social space that transcended the usual hierarchies of military life. Rank still mattered among the prisoners, and former officers maintained their authority, but in the coffee line, everyone waited their turn. The Americans, who seemed to possess unlimited supplies of everything, thought nothing of sharing. This generosity baffled the Japanese prisoners, who had been taught that resources must be hoarded, that every grain of rice might mean the difference between survival and starvation. They watched American guards pour coffee into the dirt when it grew cold, brew fresh pots for no reason except that someone wanted a cup. This waste, which should have appalled them, instead revealed something profound about the enemy they had been fighting. America possessed resources so vast that abundance had become ordinary, taken for granted in a way that no Japanese soldier could comprehend. The transformation occurring in these camps did not go unnoticed by American military intelligence. Officers recognized that Japanese prisoners who had been psychologically rehabilitated might serve a valuable purpose beyond simple interrogation. As the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, planners were already considering what would come after: the occupation of Japan, the reconstruction of a shattered nation, the prevention of the kind of festering resentment that had poisoned Europe after the First World War. The prisoners in camps like Guam represented a potential resource, men who had experienced American culture firsthand, who could testify to their treatment, who might serve as bridges between victor and vanquished. Some prisoners were trained in democratic principles, given rudimentary education in American history and government. They read translations of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, documents that presented ideas fundamentally incompatible with the totalitarian militarism they had served. The notion that all men are created equal, that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, that individual liberty supersedes state authority. These concepts struck many prisoners as dangerous, perhaps even childish. Yet they could not deny the evidence before their eyes. America, built on these principles, had defeated Japan. American abundance, American innovation, American productive capacity had proven decisive. Perhaps, some prisoners began to think, there was something to be learned from the enemy. By June 1945, as B-29s reduced Japanese cities to ash and the Imperial Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force, the baseball games on Guam continued with surreal normalcy. Corporal Yamada had become proficient enough to occasionally strike out American guards in exhibition matches. He had learned enough English to joke with his captors, to explain the differences between Japanese and American culture, to serve as informal liaison between prisoners and camp administration. He had also begun to grapple with an impossible question: what came next? Japan would lose the war. This much was obvious to anyone paying attention. The propaganda broadcasts that Japanese officers had shown prisoners, claiming great victories and imminent triumph, convinced no one who had seen the armada of American ships choking every Pacific harbor, the endless supply convoys, the casual waste of a nation that could afford to throw away more material than Japan had ever produced. When the war ended, Yamada knew he could not go home. His family had been notified of his heroic death at Guam. His name would be enshrined at Yasukuni, his memory honored. But he was alive, dishonored, corrupted by foreign ideas and enemy kindness. He was a ghost, legally dead, spiritually contaminated, belonging nowhere. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 reached the prisoners on Guam as fragmentary reports, whispers and rumors that seemed too terrible to believe. When the truth emerged, entire cities obliterated in single blasts, casualties in the hundreds of thousands, destruction beyond anything in human history. The prisoners experienced a complex mixture of horror and relief. The war was over. Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The empire had fallen. For men who had already died once, who had crossed the threshold of surrender and survived, this final catastrophe arrived as confirmation of everything they had learned in captivity. America possessed not just superior numbers or better logistics but weapons that transcended conventional warfare, technologies that made resistance suicidal. The baseball gloves and coffee, the casual abundance and the genuine kindness, were not aberrations but expressions of a society capable of producing such overwhelming force that it could afford to be generous. This realization settled over the camps like fallout, invisible but transformative. In the months following Japan's surrender, as occupation forces established themselves in Tokyo and American administrators began the work of remaking Japanese society, many prisoners faced an agonizing choice. Some opted for repatriation, accepting whatever shame awaited them at home, hoping that in the chaos of defeat their survival might be forgiven or overlooked. Others requested to remain in American custody, fearful of what they might face in a Japan they no longer recognized. A few, including Corporal Yamada, were recruited into the occupation administration, serving as translators and cultural advisors, men who understood both worlds and could navigate the treacherous currents of the immediate post-war period. Yamada would eventually return to Japan in 1947, settling not in Osaka where his family believed him dead, but in Hiroshima, where he worked for the Allied occupation forces helping to rebuild what the atomic bomb had destroyed. He never contacted his family, never reclaimed his identity. He had become someone else in that prisoner camp, someone who could drink coffee without thinking of it as foreign, who could catch a baseball with practiced ease, who had learned that enemies might be human after all. The baseball gloves, distributed to dozens of prisoner camps across the Pacific, served their purpose and were eventually discarded or distributed to Japanese civilians in the post-war period. Some found their way to Japanese youth leagues, where they introduced a generation of children to the American game. Baseball would become Japan's most popular sport in the decades following the war, a cultural transplant that took root with unexpected vigor. The coffee, too, would become ubiquitous, transforming from exotic luxury to everyday beverage as Japan rebuilt itself with American assistance. These symbols of American culture, introduced to prisoners of war in the most unlikely circumstances, became markers of a broader transformation. Japan would not be destroyed and abandoned like Germany after the First World War, left to fester in resentment and economic collapse. Instead, America would invest billions in reconstruction, share technology, open markets, build a partnership from the ashes of enmity. The generosity shown to prisoners in camps like Guam represented a glimpse of the post-war order, a preview of an occupation that would be remembered not for vengeance but for an attempt, however imperfect, to build something new. The historical significance of these small moments, these individual acts of kindness extended to enemy soldiers, extends beyond simple humanitarian sentiment. They represented a conscious rejection of the cycle of atrocity and retaliation that had characterized so much of the Pacific War. American policymakers, having witnessed the consequences of punitive peace after World War I, chose a different path. The baseball gloves and coffee were not accidents or individual generosities, but expressions of a systematic policy designed to demonstrate American values to the enemy. The message was clear: America did not fight to enslave or destroy, but to defend principles it believed universal. This narrative, however self-serving, however blind to America's own contradictions and failures, nonetheless shaped the post-war world in profound ways. Japan's transformation from militarist empire to democratic ally, from enemy to partner, began in those prisoner camps where captured soldiers learned that surrender need not mean death, that enemies could show mercy, that abundance might be shared rather than hoarded. The documented accounts from Japanese prisoners who survived American captivity reveal a consistent pattern of shock, disbelief, and gradual acceptance. In interviews conducted decades after the war, men who had been captured described their first encounters with American forces in terms that suggest profound psychological trauma. They had prepared for death, had been taught that capture equated to eternal shame, had internalized propaganda that depicted the enemy as subhuman monsters. The reality: guards who offered cigarettes, medics who treated wounds without discrimination, administrators who organized recreational activities, shattered their ideological framework entirely. Many prisoners described feeling as if they had died and awakened in some strange afterlife, a place where the rules they had learned no longer applied. The baseball games, mentioned in numerous accounts, stand out as particularly memorable experiences. For men who had known only the rigid hierarchies and brutal discipline of the Imperial Japanese Army, the sight of American soldiers playing a game with evident joy, arguing over rules with democratic fervor, laughing at their own mistakes, represented a cultural revelation. War, these prisoners discovered, did not have to consume everything. Even soldiers could play. The coffee, in retrospective accounts, carries its own weight of meaning. Many former prisoners described the taste as their first sensory experience of America, the bitter complexity of the drink suggesting a culture they would spend years trying to understand. Some learned to love it with convert zeal, drinking cup after cup until the caffeine made them jittery, as if by consuming American beverages they might absorb American strength. Others never acquired the taste but appreciated the ritual, the gathering of men in the cooling evening, the moment of respite from contemplating an uncertain future. In the symbolic economy of the prisoner camps, coffee represented everything Japan lacked: abundance, casualness, the luxury of waste. America could afford to give away coffee to prisoners while Japan's civilians starved. This disparity, more eloquent than any propaganda, told the truth about which nation would prevail. The legacy of these wartime encounters extends into the present day. Japan and the United States, once bitter enemies engaged in total war, became perhaps the most successful example of post-war reconciliation in history. The reasons for this transformation are complex and multifaceted: Cold War geopolitics, economic incentives, cultural exchanges, strategic necessity. But underneath the grand historical forces, there existed millions of individual interactions, moments when enemies recognized each other's humanity despite everything that had happened. The prisoner camps, where Japanese soldiers first encountered American culture directly, represented one thread in this larger tapestry of reconciliation. The men who survived these camps carried their experiences forward, sharing stories with family and friends, testifying to the unexpected kindness they had received. These accounts, however small, however personal, helped shape Japanese perceptions of America in the immediate post-war period. They suggested that occupation might not mean oppression, that defeat need not equal destruction, that perhaps this enemy genuinely believed in the principles it claimed to represent. On clear evenings on Guam, as the tropical sun set over the Pacific in explosions of orange and gold, the prisoners sometimes gathered to watch the American guards play baseball in the fading light. They sat along the fence line, calling encouragement, arguing about plays, slowly learning the arcane rules and statistics that Americans treated with religious seriousness. Corporal Yamada, watching these games, sometimes thought about the schoolchildren he had taught in Osaka before the war, before the military draft had pulled him into uniform and sent him to die on a distant island. He had taught them mathematics and history, had tried to prepare them for lives he could never have imagined they would lead. Now, sitting in a prisoner camp watching enemy soldiers play a game he was learning to understand, Yamada wondered what kind of future awaited those children. Japan was losing the war. This much was certain. But perhaps, if the stories he heard were true, if America proved as generous in victory as it had been to its prisoners, perhaps those children might have a chance to grow up in a world not entirely consumed by hatred and vengeance. The baseball glove, worn smooth by use, its leather shaped by repeated catches and throws, became for Yamada a talisman of this uncertain hope. It represented a culture that could afford to play even in wartime, that valued leisure and joy alongside discipline and sacrifice. It suggested a society built on principles fundamentally different from the rigid hierarchies and absolute loyalties he had known. Whether that society was better, whether its values could translate across cultures, whether its promises of democracy and freedom were genuine or merely propaganda, these questions Yamada could not answer. But he could catch a baseball. He could drink coffee and find it less bitter than before. He could learn English words and American jokes. He could begin to imagine a future that extended beyond the wire fence, beyond the war, into some uncertain peace where former enemies might find common ground. The historical moment when a Marine guard handed a baseball glove through the wire to a group of Japanese prisoners, when another poured steaming coffee into cups held by men who had been prepared to die, represents something larger than a single act of kindness. It represents a choice, made at policy levels and in individual moments, to break the cycle of atrocity that had characterized so much of the Pacific War. The decision to treat prisoners with dignity, to share resources freely, to introduce captured soldiers to American culture through sports and recreation rather than through interrogation and punishment, reflected a particular vision of what America aspired to be. That vision was imperfect and incomplete, contradicted by segregation at home and brutality in combat zones, compromised by strategic calculations and political necessities. But in those prisoner camps, in those moments of unexpected generosity, it became real enough to transform men who had been taught to hate into witnesses who could testify that enemies, too, could be human. The war ended. The prisoners went home, or didn't, or became something other than what they had been. The baseball gloves wore out and were replaced, or weren't, or found their way into the hands of Japanese children learning a foreign game in the rubble of their cities. The coffee continued to flow, in occupation offices and reconstruction agencies, in meetings between former enemies now awkward allies, in 10,000 small exchanges that built bridges across the chasm of war. And men like Corporal Yamada, who had crossed over from one world into another, who had learned that surrender need not mean death and that enemies might extend mercy, carried those lessons forward into a future none of them could have predicted. They became living bridges between the world that had been destroyed and the world that was being built, witnesses to the possibility that even the bitterest conflicts might end in something other than total vengeance, that abundance shared might be more powerful than abundance hoarded, that a baseball glove and a cup of coffee could sometimes speak truths that weapons never could.